Okay, declaring sub-namespaces. Much like directories and files, PHP namespaces also contain the ability to specify a hierarchy of namespace names. Thus, a namespace name can be defined with sublevels. Okay, here's an example, declaring a single namespace with hierarchy. Okay, here's a declaration, just like the one we saw right before this one. Except this one is not namespace my project or whatever. It's namespace my project with sublevels. And notice these are backward slashes. Okay? The above example creates constant my project sublevel connect. Okay, it basically creates this, which is from this one, and a class here, and a function here. Okay, this one's a constant, this one's a class, this one's a function. Now we're going to do defining multiple namespaces in the same file. Okay, first of all, remember what I said before, that when you define a namespace, it's for a file. Okay, it applies to the script file, okay? The file itself, okay? But now I'm telling you that multiple namespaces may also be declared in the same file. There are two allowed syntaxes. This one and this one, okay? The first one is declaring multiple namespaces simple combination syntax. In other words, you put the namespace statement, the first thing in the document, and then this other namespace statement will break the file into two namespaces. Okay, the whole premise here is that namespace statements are processed before any other code is processed. That's why you don't want to have any code that would come, or white space that would come before a namespace statement. Okay, because one of the first things that a PHP processor does is look for stuff related to namespaces, and it doesn't want to see anything else before it. And once it sees one, it'll look for possibly another one in the same file. Okay, so this syntax is not recommended for combining namespaces into a single file. Instead, it is recommended to use the alternate bracketed syntax, which is this one down here. Okay? So this is the title here is declaring multiple namespaces, the bracketed syntax. That's what this is, okay? Notice that instead of a semicolon here and a semicolon here, we have a bracket here, bracket here, bracket here, bracket here, okay? It is strongly discouraged as a coding practice to combine multiple namespaces into the same file. The primary use case is to combine multiple PHP scripts into the same file. To combine global non-namespaced code with namespaced code, in other words, instead of combining two namespaces, we're combining one namespace with global non-namespaced code, okay? So to do that, only bracketed syntax is supported. Global code should be encapsulated in a namespace statement with no namespace name as in, okay? So here's the namespace part, and here's the global part, the global code. Notice that the global code does have the brackets, and it is in a namespace statement. But there is no name given for that namespace. That's why it's global, okay? So, no PHP code may exist outside the namespace brackets except for an opening declare statement. Okay, that's obvious, okay? We already talked about whitespace in a different clip. Using namespaces basics. Before discussing the use of namespaces, it is important to understand how PHP knows which namespaced element your code is requesting. A simple analogy can be made between PHP namespaces and a file system. There are three ways to access a file in a file system. Relative file name, relative path name, in other words, relative to the current directory, but the specification is inside of a directory, and absolute path name, like ones that start with a /. The same principle can be applied to namespaced elements in PHP. For example, a class name can be referred to in three ways. Using an unqualified name or an unprefixed class name, using a qualified name, okay, this one was unqualified, this is qualified, or a prefixed class name. This was unprefixed, this was prefixed. The third one is a fully qualified name, or a prefixed name with a global prefix. That's the important part. Global prefix operator. Okay, now let me show you some examples. File1.php. Alright, this is the standard way. Foo, in all three cases here, is going to be foo bar sub namespace foo. And this method, well, I'll show you later, can also be accessed using the prefix foo bar. Okay, file2. Now the namespace here is foo bar, which is the same as up here. Okay, so we include file1.
Later on, I'm going to debate whether including an external file splits up the namespace. But don't worry about it too much, because include statements are not generally used in namespaces. The use statement is. So it doesn't really matter anyways.
Which we'll read in this stuff. Okay, now, here in foo bar, we also declare foo all three ways. Okay, the same stuff here is declared. But here, foo equals 1 for the constant, foo equals 2 for the constant down here. Okay, so now what happens if we just use foo in file 2? That would resolve to foo bar foo. Same with the other two here. Okay? It resolves to foo bar foo, the static method. Okay? Now, if we use sub namespace and use a qualified name, okay, remember this is sub namespace right here. Okay, then it will splice the foo bar because we're already in foo bar, and it'll splice on it the sub namespace. Note that, however, that we had to have had included, run the include statement here, which includes file 1. Okay? And the fully qualified name, that's very obvious, okay? That always works. All right, here it says, note that to access any global class, function, or constant, a fully qualified name can be used, such as... Oh, okay. So let's say you want to use strlen, and it's the global one, okay? Well, now that you're already in a namespace, because you issued a namespace statement, then you have to precede it with a / in order to get the global strlen. Okay, the same with exception, constants and all that stuff. Okay, accessing global class function constants with a namespace. Okay, and here's a more example of doing just that. Okay, see, now, if you have a namespace statement, then you have to precede all the regular ones with a /. Otherwise, you'll be accessing these ones, which are actually part of the foo namespace. So you wouldn't be accessing the global one. Okay. And this comment here talks about the syntax for extending classes in namespaces. And it works pretty much the way you would think it would work. Here's the namespace. Here's a class definition. Here's another class definition. And it uses this to properly resolve the parent class. Okay, by the way, this one is in a different file. That's why we had to do this. If it was in the same file, we would just do what this guy says right here. Yeah, like this. See, object. Here we don't have to do this whole thing. All right. And here, this try catch. In order to do it properly, you would also have to put a / in front of exception, just like here. Okay, here. Namespaces and dynamic language features. PHP's implementation of namespaces is influenced by its dynamic nature as a programming language. Okay, when they say dynamic nature, they are talking about, let's see, these things that are affected at runtime. Like echo method is going to echo out the method name, which is this right here. Okay? And function name. Remember, the function name can be a variable, so it could end up being assigned during runtime. So dynamically, I guess that's one of the meanings of dynamic. Anyways, okay? So, thus, to convert code like the following example into namespaced code. Okay, example1.php. Let's say we have this code right here. Okay? You have a file called example1.php. And you defined the class name, the function func name, and the constant const name. And const name here is defined as global, okay? Down here, we're going to define it as namespaced, okay? So, to convert code like the following, which is non-namespaced, into namespaced code, one must use the fully qualified name, okay? So to do it, one must use the fully qualified name, which is the class name with namespace prefix.
All right, $A, $B that you see in the example 2, those are values that are assigned during runtime, okay? That is why they are outside of the namespace of this file. The reason is not, as I state later in this video, that it is because of the include statement, which includes file 1.
Note that because there is no difference, okay, this is kind of a subtle thing, and I'll let you figure this one out by yourself. Okay, so here's the example number 2, okay? This is a different file. It's not example1.php, although it will be including example1.php. Okay, so here We have a namespace. That's the difference. Okay? And I want you to note one thing. We have an include statement here. So, we have namespace, namespace name, and we define this class, func name, and, okay, we define a class, a function, and constant as follows. And they're basically the same, except the constant name is namespaced. Okay, so they're the same as up here. Now over here, the next line, we're going to include example1.php, which is going to define these. And it's also going to end the namespace up here. So down here, when we say a equals class name and then object equals new $a, which is the $class name, it's going to run the constructor. It's up for the one in example 1, okay? Because this is not qualified, okay?
And the reason it's not qualified is these variables are defined during runtime, not during pre-compile time by PHP.
And remember now, we're not in a namespace, so we're in the global space. Okay, so if we have an unqualified names, as opposed to the fully qualified ones down here, okay, we're going to end up with whatever came in example1.php, which is the global stuff. And then the ones down here are fully qualified, and they will be the one referred to these ones up here, which are in the namespace name, okay? Now I'll go back and read this. It says, note that because there is no difference between a qualified and a fully qualified name inside a dynamic class name, function name, or constant name, the leading / is not necessary. Okay?